We're going to start in South Kensington, work our way around the local area. You can see the neighbourhood where Boston University's London campus has all of its buildings, and then we'll go into the middle of town and see some of the most famous sites as well. I'm standing, by the way, outside the Crofton, which is the largest of our 3 residences here in the South Kensington neighbourhood. We're going to go around the corner where there is a very historic site, just literally yards from where we're standing now. So let's go. So here we are. There really is history around every corner here in London. London itself actually dates back 2,000 years. It was a Roman settlement by the name of Londinium. And one of the things about London is ever since then, through all the times that have come since, Anglo-Saxon, the Norman invasion, Middle Ages, the Renaissance, through to the Industrial Revolution and modern day, generations of Londoners have essentially built on what came before. And so if you dig deep enough in London, literally dig, you will find remnants of an ancient city. For example, as recently as 1988, which isn't that long ago, in the other end of the city at London's Guildhall, they discovered, after 100 years of searching, the remains of what was left of London's Roman Amphitheatre, where the gladiators used to fight. And of course now you can go and visit those remains in the basement of the building that they were digging the foundations for when they found those remains. So that's an example of just how much history there is under your feet, around every corner, wherever you go in London. This is no exception. This is, as I said, just around the corner from where we live in South Kensington. This is Kensington Palace, one of several royal palaces here in London. It dates back to the 17th century, but it actually has more recent history that's very interesting as well. If you are a recent history buff, you may recognise these gates behind me. In 1997, this was right where I'm standing now, was where literally a sea of flowers was left by mourning Londoners after the death of Princess Diana, because Princess Diana lived in this building. More recently, her sons have lived here, William and Kate. Of course, William being the second in line to the British throne, he lives here. Harry and Meghan lived here for a while as well before they moved to America, which is obviously something we find a little bit awkward and we don't talk about too much. So yeah, Kensington Palace right around the corner. We're also in Hyde Park. Well, this part is technically called Kensington Gardens, and then it spreads out into Hyde Park, one of London's biggest green spaces, right on our doorstep where we live here in South Kensington. So we are very, very lucky. And also there's plenty more to see, and we're going to walk just a little bit back towards the Crofton, and I'm going to show you another world famous landmark that is right near where we live. I'm standing outside the Royal Albert Hall. It's one of the world's most famous concert venues, opened in 1871 by Queen Victoria. It's named after her late husband, Prince Albert, who also has a big statue, a big memorial to him over the other side of the building, just across the road there. Now, the Royal Albert Hall has about 400 different performances in a normal year, including perhaps most notably between July and September every year, the BBC Proms, a season of classical music events that's broadcast live on the BBC. It also has lots of pop music stuff as well. Throughout the years, we've had the Beatles here, Pink Floyd, Queen, Kylie Minogue, Arctic Monkeys, One Direction, you name it, they've all played here at the Royal Albert Hall. Plus we have sports as well. Tennis is often here, basketball, boxing, you name it, they've had it at the Albert Hall. Now we are just yards away again from the Crofton, as well as about 10 minutes walk away from our other residences and our academics building. We're also just adjacent to Imperial College, which is one of London's largest universities. It's a place where almost every programme on the BU London programme, students get associate membership of the Students' Union there, so that they're able to interact and socialise with British students and students from all around the world. So Imperial College is another really useful thing to have right next to us, as is the Royal Albert Hall. I'm standing outside number 43 Harrington Gardens, which is our academic centre here in London. Again, this is within a 10 or 15-minute walk of pretty much all of our residences. It's just around the corner, in fact, from one of them, Courtfield Gardens. This is where you would come for our academic affairs office, our student affairs office. The majority of our classrooms are here. It's also where we have our library, where you can borrow thousands of different volumes. There's free printing down there as well, and it's open late quite a lot of the time during the semester. The building itself is lovely as well, because it's from the late 19th century, and it's what we call Grade 2 listed, which means it's protected in some ways because of its historical significance. So it's a nice building to look around anyway, and we're very lucky to have it as our main academic centre here in London. We're going to take a walk just up the street, and I'm going to show you a couple of, well, 3 different, in fact, museums that make up the heart of South Kensington as a neighbourhood. We are extremely fortunate to live in South Kensington as we do, particularly if you're one of the residents of Sorbonne House on our programme. Sorbonne House is just across the road from where I'm standing now. It also used to be the home of Winston Churchill back in the First World War, for part of the First World War, so a few years before he became Prime Minister, but nonetheless a very famous alumnus of one of our residences. Now, the building that I'm standing in front of here is the Natural History Museum. The Natural History Museum is one of 3 museums in a row that we have here on this main street here in South Kensington. The Natural History Museum, of course, famous for its dinosaur bones and for an entire section dedicated to Charles Darwin. In fact, it also has some of Darwin's specimens that he collected back in the 19th century on his travels. Next to the Natural History Museum is the Science Museum. Science Museum has exhibits on everything from video games to outer space, and actually has the command module from Apollo 10. If you're a space travel enthusiast, that would be something I'm sure you want to see. Finally, the last of those 3 is the Victoria and Albert Museum, the V&A. It is one of the biggest museums in the world, with 2 million permanent exhibits, and is a world-class hub for decorative painting and sculpture. All 3 of those museums, like most of the major museums and art galleries here in London, are absolutely free to visit. They are government subsidised, so you don't have to pay a penny. Some of the exhibits within them may cost a little bit more to go and see, but they are right here on our doorstep, literally, in the case of one of our residences, the Natural History Museum, Science Museum, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. Right, on that note, I think what we're going to go and do is, we've spent enough time in South Kensington, so we're going to walk this way behind me and head into the middle of London and look at some more of our very famous landmarks. So we're on our way from South Kensington into the middle of London now. I thought we'd stop in this neighbourhood very briefly. We are in Knightsbridge, and Knightsbridge is perhaps most famous for this building you can see behind me. This is Harrods. Harrods is one of the world's most famous department stores. It has over 330 departments, and of course its world famous Victorian style food halls. Set over 1 million square feet in retail space. It's one of the world's largest department stores, and of course it is 170 years old. So Harrods is really a London institution, one of several, along with Selfridges, Fortnum & Mason, various other historic department stores here in London. This one is probably about a 20-minute walk from most of our residences, and it is, as I said, on our way into the middle of town, which is where we're going now. I'm sure you recognise the building behind me. We are at Buckingham Palace, right in the middle of London. Now, Buckingham Palace actually started life in 1700 as Buckingham House. It was owned by the Duke of Buckingham, hence the name. It was a private townhouse. And then a few years later, in 1760, King George III, the same King George of all that unpleasantness with the US in 1776, he came round to Buckingham House to see the Duke of Buckingham for lunch one day, and being the king, he said to the Duke, "Oh, I really like your house." And the Duke said, "Thank you very much." And the king said, "No, I really, really like your house, and I'm the king, so I will have your house." And so after that, it was acquired by the royal family and has been a royal house ever since then. Buckingham Palace has been the residence of the monarch since 1837, when Queen Victoria became queen, and she chose to have it as her primary place of living. And it's become an iconic site here in London. One of the things to know about it is you can see the flag on top of the building there. If that flag is the royal standard, a special royal flag flying above the palace, then that means the Queen is home right now. If it is the normal Union flag, the British flag, then that means, as it is today, that the Queen is not here today. But that is a good way to tell whether the Queen is in the house or not. Buckingham Palace is open to the public a couple of months a year, kind of July, August, September sort of time. And so we tend to offer tickets to it on the social programme, our subsidised programme of events and trips for students here in London during maybe the end of the summer semester, start of the fall semester, if we're able to get tickets during that time. So you might be able, depending on the time of year you're here, you might be able to go in and see Buckingham Palace. There's lots else to see around here as well, of course. The road that leads up to the palace is the Mall, and it's got that distinctive red tarmac meant to resemble a red carpet. You can see as well the flagpoles on either side of the Mall. If we had a head of state, for example the US president, coming to visit on a state visit, what we would have is on those flagpoles alternating British and American flags. And so the idea is that when the motorcade sweeps up the Mall towards the palace, flags on either side, it's intended to be a spectacular sight. The Mall is flanked on either side by two more royal parks, St James's Park and Green Park, and there's also several royal residences dotted along the Mall as well. One of them is Clarence House, which used to be the residence of the Queen Mother, the current Queen's mother. She lived there until she died in 2002 at the age of 102. It's now used by Prince Charles and Camilla, of course Charles, the heir to the British throne. He lives there at the moment. The other big palace down on the Mall is St James's Palace, built in the 1500s by King Henry VIII, the king famous for his 6 wives and also for taking Britain, or England at least, outside of the Catholic Church in the 1500s. It is the oldest palace in this area, is St James's Palace, and it is still kind of the more senior of the palaces. You'd think Buckingham Palace might be, but actually anyone who becomes an ambassador, for example, becomes an ambassador to the court of St James. So St James's Palace, an important part of this royal puzzle in this part of town. Right now I'm going to take a walk down the Mall and show you one of our most famous public spaces, which is down at the other end. Alright, I'm standing in Trafalgar Square, which is pretty much London's most famous public meeting space, if you like. This is the kind of place where crowds will gather for New Year's Eve. We have the Pride Festival here every summer. It's also the place where we get rallies and demonstrations and all those sorts of things tend to congregate here. I actually saw Nelson Mandela, of all people, speak on the steps here a long time ago, back in about 2005. And so it really is a place where history is often made. It's also the home of the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery. Those are two more of our free museums and galleries in London that you can visit if you wish while you are here. Some of the world-class art in there. But perhaps the most prominent landmark here in Trafalgar Square is just over my shoulder here, Nelson's Column. It is named after Admiral Lord Nelson, who led Britain in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 against Napoleon's France. It was a decisive battle in the Napoleonic Wars, and that is what the square is named after. Interestingly, Nelson was wounded fatally at the beginning of the Battle of Trafalgar. He spent the next 3 or 4 hours below deck, slowly bleeding to death, while still giving out orders via a messenger for how the battle at sea should be carried out. When he died, Nelson's body was reportedly folded in half and stored in a barrel of brandy for the journey home, which is about a 6-week voyage from the south of Spain back around to London. And when they got back, the captain opened up the barrel, looked inside. Nelson's body was still there, but all the brandy was gone. And what happened was several sailors had drilled holes in the barrel and poured themselves a drink. So if you ever hear the term to pour yourself a stiff drink, That's where it comes from Nelson being transported back to England after the Battle of Trafalgar. So there's a fairly gruesome story about Trafalgar Square, one of our top meeting places and a real central point in London. In fact, it's the very central point in London, because it is from this place here that road signs throughout the UK point to when they talk about London. So if you were in Manchester, for example, and it said, oh, you're 200 miles to London, it means 200 miles to this very point. So in terms of how our road signs are worked out, this is the central point of our city. I'm standing in London's ceremonial parade ground. It's called Horse Guards Parade. It's another part of London that was set up by Henry VIII back in the 1500s, and it used to be used for jousting, when people go back and forth on horses trying to knock each other off with sticks. Nowadays we use it for an annual parade to celebrate the Queen's official birthday, because she's the Queen. She gets 2 birthdays, because why not? And so her official birthday in June is celebrated with a military parade on this spot called Trooping the Colour every year. The rest of the year this is pretty much an empty space, but it's got some very interesting points around it. First of all, off to my right here, the Admiralty Citadel, it's called, and that is a fortress, a fortified building that was built in World War II, covered in ivy so that it looked like trees from up in the sky, so that it wouldn't get bombed, hopefully. And it was a basis for naval intelligence during World War II. We still think it's used for strange things now. It's got no windows and satellite dishes pointing out in every direction. But if you're a James Bond fan, then that's a very important building for you, because Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond novels, worked there during World War II in intelligence, and it is believed that he came up with a lot of the ideas for James Bond, the character, and the stories, while he was working there during the war. If we swing around, the building behind me is the Horse Guards building. Got a couple of interesting stories to tell about this one. Now, first of all, it's been here a long time. Back in 1894, Queen Victoria came down here to look at the guards who were on parade, or on duty rather, every day, and found that no one was standing there, no one was at their posts. And so she went into the side room and found that all the guards who were supposed to be working were drunk and playing cards. So she said, right, as punishment for this, every single day for the next 100 years, you and all those who follow you in this role will have to stand at attention at 4 p.m. and we'll check that you're not drunk, that you're doing your job right, that your uniform is correct. And so the idea of this punishment inspection was that it would go on until 100 years later, 1994, but we've decided to continue it because it's quite funny, really. So the punishment inspection goes on every day here at 4 o'clock, and you can see it if you are here. It is, of course, a testament to those guards from 1894, who I'm sure are very, very popular with their colleagues to this very day. Another interesting thing about the building behind me is the clock on top, the Horse Guards building clock. Now, this is an old clock. It used to be, until Big Ben was built in the 1850s, it was the sort of central clock, if you like, that was used for keeping time in central London. If you look at the number 2 on the clock, you'll see there's like a black stain. It's like a kind of a smear on the clock face. That's deliberate, because it refers to the time of day, 2 p.m. in 1649, when Charles I was executed just in a building very close to him. And the idea of having that on the clock there is that clock face faces Buckingham Palace. So it's the members of Parliament reminding whoever is the monarch of the day never to again overstep their bounds, overstep their authority, or Parliament might behead them like they did with Charles I in 1649. It was a fairly sinister notification, if you like, to the monarch from the Parliament, and that remains there to this day, or at least as legend has it. Over to my left is the current political leaders building. That is 10 Downing Street, or at least the back of it. You can see the brick wall there, and over that brick wall is the back garden of number 10 Downing Street, our equivalent, if you like, of the White House, where our Prime Minister lives and entertains foreign guests and all that kind of thing. So a lot to see here in Horse Guards Parade. and we're going to walk through this arch behind me onto one of Britain's most famous streets. I'm standing on a road called Whitehall. The reason it's called Whitehall is because many years before Buckingham Palace existed, the biggest palace in London was called Whitehall Palace and stood on this very spot. It's all burned down many hundreds of years ago now, except for one building which you can still visit on this street. It's called the Banqueting House, one of the main parts of the old Whitehall Palace, and it was in front of that Banqueting House in 1649 where that execution of Charles I happened that I was talking about a little bit earlier on. It's the only time in the past 1,000 years or so that Britain has chosen to get rid of its monarchy and to become a republic, although in our case it only lasted for 11 years, but nonetheless a very historic spot. Nowadays, where that palace used to be, we have a road called Whitehall. That's what I'm standing on now. Along this road there's several government departments, including the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office, which is like our State Department, Her Majesty's Treasury, which is where we count all the money when we have any, and various other government departments as well. You can see a couple of memorials. The one immediately behind me is our nation's most famous war memorial. It's the Cenotaph. There's also a memorial to the women of World War II, which was put up a little bit more recently. And so there's several places around here that reflect on Britain's past. Another one just off this street and down a little side road is the Churchill War Rooms. That's another place we offer tickets to on our social program. The Churchill War Rooms is essentially a network of underground tunnels underneath the Treasury building, with like offices, a map room, a cabinet room, and it's where Winston Churchill and his cabinet and his military chiefs met and planned Britain's war effort secretly during World War II. After 1945, when the war was finished, it essentially got put away, locked away, that entire network of tunnels, and then wasn't used again until the 1970s when it was opened up and was to become a museum. So going down there, you very much get the sense of being in that 1940s situation with bombs dropping on London and being around Winston Churchill and thinking what he's going to try and do to stop the Nazi advance. So a very atmospheric and historic location, the Churchill War Rooms, and a very important part of town generally. This really, Whitehall is other than Downing Street, which leads off of Whitehall may be our most famous street in the country. It's certainly the heart of the British political establishment. Well, we've reached what would normally be perhaps Britain's most iconic landmark, except of course, as you can see, the tower behind me here is currently covered in scaffold. This is Big Ben, or to give it its proper name, the Elizabeth Tower. Big Ben is the name of the bell inside the clock tower. It's been under scaffold since 2017. I'm recording this in 2021. I think the maintenance work that they're doing on it is supposed to finish this year. So if you're planning on coming to London after 2021, then maybe you'll get to see Big Ben in all of its glory a little bit more. But more broadly, this is called the Palace of Westminster, this building behind me. It's been here, or parts of it have been here, for almost 1,000 years, and it's been the seat of the British Parliament since about the 1500s. It's got a load of interesting stories, of course, as you would expect, related to it. One of them is from 1605, when Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators decided they were going to try and blow up Parliament on November the 5th. Remember the 5th of November, when the King and all of the Lords and all of the members of Parliament were going to be gathered in one place for the state opening of Parliament, our equivalent of the State of the Union address. And he's inspired all sorts of films, like V for Vendetta is of course about the gunpowder plot. So the gunpowder plot, just one of many interesting stories about Parliament. There's a lot to see around this square. This is called Parliament Square. There are statues here of various prime ministers. but also with some really interesting figures who you might not expect to see in Britain's capital. You've got a statue of Gandhi, who of course at one time was considered an enemy of the British state. Nelson Mandela is here as well. There's a statue of Abraham Lincoln, which many of you might be surprised to see as well. And so all sorts of statues here. The most recent one is from 2018. It's the first ever female statue in Parliament Square, and it's of Millicent Fawcett, one of the suffragists who was instrumental in securing the vote for some women here in the UK, which they got in 1918. So it's a really interesting place. Obviously, Parliament Square. Parliament is open to visit actually at some times during the year, on Fridays and Saturdays when it's not sitting. So you can come and visit and go and walk in the two chambers, the House of Commons, the House of Lords, which are our equivalent of the House of Representatives and the Senate. You can go and see those as well. So Parliament Square, and my apologies again that Big Ben is currently covered in scaffold. And so we've reached the final stop in our tour. This is Westminster Abbey, and much like the Parliament site that I was talking about just a moment ago, there has been an abbey on this site for about 1,000 years as well. So in fact more than that, I think since the 900s. So Westminster Abbey is an ancient place. Most of the current abbey dates back to the 1500s, and it is really one of Britain's most important churches. Every monarch since and including William the Conqueror in the year 1066 has had their coronation inside this building. It's also been home to many royal weddings, of course. William and Kate was perhaps the most recent famous one in about 2011 when they got married. It's the final resting place as well of over 3,300 people. 16 monarchs are buried here, 8 prime ministers, scientists, poet laureates, military chiefs, just about everyone from the kind of the great and the good of British life that you could possibly imagine. Westminster Abbey is a real historical site that you really should visit if you come and visit us in London. That is the end of our virtual tour. Thank you for joining me on what has been a fairly cold January morning as we've had a little stroll around London. I hope it's been entertaining for you. Don't forget, of course, that you can follow us on Instagram. Our Instagram handle is at BostonULondon. That's at BostonULondon. Got lots of content on there all of the time.